Judgment is something which is the basic foundation of a justice delivery system. Our justice delivery system is so formatted that the proceedings have to necessarily conclude in a judgment. In the normal course of things, when we talk of a judgment, we would be taken to have referred to civil or criminal proceedings. But it has to necessarily include, and it does include, the proceedings in the revenue courts or in the taxation courts. A judgment, it is statutorily also provided in the CRPC section 354 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, must include the points for determination and the decision taken by the court. In the normal course of things, we'll take it like this. Whether on the civil side or on the criminal side, a judgment must include the pleadings of the parties, the contentions canvassed in relatability to the evidence adduced, and the view taken by the court in respect of each contention. When a judgment contains all these things, nobody can have a grievance that a contention raised on its behalf or a pleading raised on its behalf had not been noticed. The view to be taken by a court is in the judicial discretion of that court. It is the right of a party to have each relevant pleading and each relevant contention canvassed during the course of hearing noticed. In fact, at the moment, law is in place which provides that written arguments, whether in the criminal cases or civil cases, can be filed. You can go to the CRPC. It is perhaps section 314 CRPC, and there is a corresponding provision in the Civil Procedure Code as well, which provides for the filing of written arguments. Once you will appreciate written arguments are filed, nobody can have a grievance, or may I say, legitimately have a grievance that there was a particular contention canvassed on behalf of the party represented by him and it was not noticed by the court. So that takes care of even the remotest element of arbitrariness, which even otherwise does not exist in our justice delivery system. In the current scenario where virtual hearings are taking place, where physical hearings do not appear to be feasible till such time a proper cure for the COVID-19 is available. We are out of time. When I say we, mean the people in the justice delivery system. The lawyers also cannot appear for fear of contracting infection. So it is in the interest of everybody that written arguments are filed. It will also facilitate appreciation of each and every contention by the presiding officers. They would hear the matters, the counsel for the parties by way of virtual hearing, relate those contentions to the written arguments, and take a view. Every judgment is good because it lays down law. I use this expression in the context of the Honorable Apex Court and the Honorable High Courts. Insofar as the trial courts, that is the magistrate courts and the courts of session are concerned, those courts are equally important, being the courts of fact. There are certain judgments, however, which are more than self-contained, which make you very relieved and proud of the justice delivery system, which you even otherwise are, because our justice delivery system stands on a very, very high pedestal in the comity of nations. What I am going to present hereinafter is relevant not only for purposes of the candidates desirous of accessing the justice delivery system by appearing for the competitive examination, but also for the law students who are studying these subjects, and also for the lawyers who are in the infancy years of the service. By the very nature of things, they would not get to read all the finer points of law till such time they get a matter on the roster. And by and large, it will be too much to expect that a youngster would devote more time in the library than on his seat to look for a potential client. Anyways, I came across two judgments which made me very happy. One of the judgments is Nandlal versus Lata Nandlal. It's Criminal Appeal number 24 of 2014. The judgment was delivered by Honorable Mr. Justice Chandramouli K. Prasad and Honorable Mr. Justice Jagdish Singh Kher on 6 January 2014. The litigating parties to the matter were estranged spouses, a husband and a wife. The wife filed an application under section 125 of the Code of Criminal Procedure to claim maintenance for self and for the child she had begotten. Her averment was that the child was begotten from the loins of her husband. The husband contested the legitimacy of the child. He in fact filed a plea for inviting DNA profiling of self and the child to support his contention that the paternity of the child is not attributable to him. The plea for holding of a DNA test was declined by the Magistrate Court. The fate was no different in revision, and obviously the husband had to go in for an SLP to challenge the orders of the Magistrate Court and the High Court declining his request for undergoing the DNA profiling. After hearing the parties, the Apex Court ordered the parties to undergo DNA profiling at Forensic Science Laboratory, Nagpur. The relevant directions were given to the parties. The test was to be held at the cost of the husband. The Nagpur FSL returned a finding that the paternity of the child was not attributable to the husband. This did not satisfy the wife. She asked for a retest. The Apex Court agreed with her, and the subsequent test was ordered to be held by the Central Forensic Science Laboratory, Hyderabad. Incidentally, CFSL Hyderabad also returned a finding in concurrence with the finding recorded by the FSL Nagpur. Back to the Apex Court, a plea was raised on behalf of the wife that orders for the holding of a DNA test ought not to have been granted in the very first instance. The bench declined to entertain the plea. It negated the plea, saying it had been passed by a coordinate bench and it was not in a position to review that order. There was no need for legitimacy for the review thereof because the holding of a test had not been contested for the Apex Court. And further because the point in issue was such which could be decided only on the basis of a DNA profiling. So that was declined. The resistance offered by the wife was declined. Then the counsel for the wife raised a plea that the holding of a DNA profiling or taking of a DNA profiling outcome into consideration was in contradiction to the provisions of section 112 of the Indian Evidence Act. That act provides for a presumption of legitimacy if a child is conceived and begotten during the subsistence of the marriage, unless of course it is proved that the couple had no access to each other. Now the apex court was faced with a very difficult situation. It analyzed both the provisions, that is the provision of section 112 and 112 of the Evidence Act and the DNA profiling. Now, the apex court, if I am given the indulgence to quote, it relied upon an earlier case, 2010 8 SCC 633, Bhavani Prasad Jaina versus Odisha State Commission for Women. That bench said, when there is apparent conflict between the right to privacy of a person not to submit himself forcibly to medical examination and duty of the court to reach the truth, the court must exercise its discretion only after balancing the interests of the parties and on due consideration whether, for a just decision in the matter, DNA test is eminently needed. DNA test in a matter relating to paternity of a child should not be directed by the court as a matter of course or in a routine manner whenever such a request is made. The relevant part of the observations made by the apex court in this case, Namzad's case, is quoted as under. We may remember that Section 112 of the Evidence Act was enacted at a time when the modern scientific advancement and DNA tests were not even in contemplation of the legislature. The result of DNA test is said to be scientifically accurate. Although Section 112 raises a presumption of conclusive proof on satisfaction of the conditions enumerated therein, but the same is rebuttable. The presumption may afford legitimate means of arriving at an affirmative legal conclusion, while the truth or fact is known. In our opinion, there is no need or room for any presumption. Where there is evidence to the contrary, the presumption is rebuttable and must yield to proof. The interest of justice is best served by ascertaining the truth, and the court should be furnished with the best available evidence and may not be left to bank upon presumptions unless science has no answer to the facts in issue. In our opinion, the court said, when there is a conflict between a conclusive proof envisaged under law and a proof based on scientific advancement accepted by the word community to be correct, the latter must prevail over the former. The quotation continues. We must understand the distinction between a legal fiction and the presumption of a fact. Legal fiction assumes existence of a fact which may not really exist. However, presumption of a fact depends on satisfaction of certain circumstances. These circumstances logically would lead to the fact sought to be presumed. Section 112 of the Evidence Act does not create a legal fiction but provides for presumption. The quotation stops. The court held that though it would be reluctant to, in a way, stigmatize the child of being an illegitimate child, it could not forestall the consequences because it said it is denying the truth. Truth must triumph is the hallmark of justice. In other words, it was held that DNA test, being scientific in nature, would outweigh the presumption under Section 112 of the Indian Evidence Act. You see, in this judgment, the candidates desirous of accessing judicial services or students reading the roster of Criminal Law or Evidence Act would find adequate material in the course of the judgment. It is not possible to elaborately refer to it in this presentation. They would find the fact and effect of the DNA profiling. They would find the implication of the presumption under section 112 of the Indian Evidence Act. They would also find a comparative study of a scenario where there is a conflict between the provisions of 112 of the Evidence Act and the DNA profiling. The other case, which is very self-contained on a large number of legal facets, is Dharamdev Yadav versus State of UP, Criminal Appeal number 369 of 2006, decided on 11th April 2014 by a bench consisting of Honorable Mr. Justice K.S. Radhakrishnan and Honorable Mr. Justice A.K. Sikri. The matter pertained to the murder of a 22-year-old girl named Diana Clay Rotley. I have no hesitation in quoting the name because it is quoted in the judgment itself. She would, for facility of reference, be referred to as Diana. She came over on a sightseeing trip to India. When her father did not hear anything from her for a number of days, he got into touch with the local police, lodged an FIR with the police. In the course of the investigation, Dharamdev Yadav was arrested along with 3 others. We would not be so much concerned about 3 others because they were acquitted while Dharamdev Yadav was convicted. On being arrested, he led the police to a trunk lying in his household. He took out a skeleton of Diana and said those were the remains of Diana whom he had murdered. He was tried. DNA profiling of a femur, a part of the femur of Diana, and blood sample of her father was undertaken, and the finding was that those tallied with each other. So the outcome was that the paternity of Diana of the first informant was established. The trial court relied upon the circumstantial evidence. There is no ocular testimony, no eyewitnesses. It also relied upon the DNA outcome. It also relied upon the recovery of the skeleton at the instance of Dharamdev Yadav and awarded the sentence of capital punishment. The order was upheld by the High Court. An appeal filed by the state against the acquittal of the other 3 accused was negatived by the High Court. Ultimately, it was only Dharamdev Yadav who came up in SLP. The point raised on his behalf was that the recovery of skeleton could not be used as incriminating evidence against him because he was not in the custody of the police. The apex court declined that contention. It used a very innovative expression. It said, I quote, this court in state of Andhra Pradesh versus Gangula Satyamurthy, 1997 1 SCC 272 held that if the accused is within the ken of surveillance of the police during which his movements are restricted, then it can be regarded as custodial surveillance. By relying upon that judgment, it said that it really did not matter if he was not in the formal custody of the police. It was indeed in the custodial surveillance of the police, during which he led the party to a trunk lying in at his residence and got the recovery of the skeleton effected. The apex court, in a display of an extremely fine appreciation of law, also innovated something by saying, I quote, Assuming that the recovery of skeleton was not in terms of Section 27 of the Evidence Act, on the premise that the accused was not in the custody of the police by the time he made the statement so made by him would be admissible as conduct under Section 8 of the Evidence Act. The unquote. The Apex Court also noticed that there was absolutely no explanation by the appellant therein as to how the skeleton of Dinah was concealed in his house, especially when the statement made by him to PW14 was held to be admissible in evidence. So these two fine law points were reiterated by the Apex Court. Insofar as the expert evidence is concerned, the Apex Court placed implicit reliance upon it by noticing that it was expert evidence and there is no way reliance thereupon could be declined. It noticed that there could be some difficulty in obtaining eyewitnesses or in obtaining witnesses who are truthful or who were capable of standing the test of cross-examination. It held in that context, I quote, criminal justice system in this country is at crossroads. Many times reliable, trustworthy, credible witnesses to the crime seldom come forward to depose before the court. And even the hardened criminals get away from the clutches of law. Even the reliable witnesses for the prosecution turn hostile due to intimidation, fear, and a host of other reasons. Investigating agency has therefore to look for other ways and means to improve the quality of investigation, which can only be through the collection of scientific evidence. In this age of science, we have to build legal foundations that are sound in science as well as in law. Practices and principles that served in the past, now people think, must give way to innovative and creative methods if we want to save our criminal justice system. Emerging new types of crimes and their level of sophistication, the traditional methods and tools have become outdated. Hence, the necessity to strengthen the forensic science for crime detection. Constant interaction of judges with scientists, engineers would promote and widen their knowledge to deal with such scientific evidence and to effectively deal with criminal cases based on scientific evidence. We are not advocating that in all cases the scientific evidence is the sure test, but only emphasizing the necessity of promoting scientific evidence also to detect and prove crimes over and above the other evidence. By holding the above, the Apex Court sent a message all through the territory of India, because each and every observation made by the Apex Court is the law of the land. To the best of my information, there is hardly any stress at different administrative levels about facilitating the interaction of the judicial officers with the forensic methodology in its various facets. Even if it is there, it needs to be emphasized and enhanced. This judgment also dealt with the importance of circumstantial evidence, including the last seen evidence, and ultimately it affirmed the finding of indictment. It did, however, hold that the case did not fall in the rarest of rare categories, deserving the imposition of capital punishment. Very, very revealing observations, very self-speaking observations, which I propose to quote for the benefit of all concerned. The court, relying upon Shankar Kishan Rao Khade versus State of Maharashtra, 2013, 5 SCC 546, reiterated the principles laid down therein, that is, the crime test, criminal test, and RR test. Unquote. These are the three tests which should determine whether the case falls in the category of the rarest of rare cases or not. On the basis of the available evidence, the apex court held that since there was no evidence about the manner, or say the barbaric manner, in which the murder had been committed, it could not hold that the murder had indeed been committed in a barbaric manner. Murder it was, but whether it had been committed in a barbaric manner, there is no evidence to prove that. It did not attach any importance to those other pleas that he had married in the meantime, or he had issues, or that he had a living father. But it did say that the case does not fall in the category of rarest of rare cases because there is no evidence to prove that it was any better than a routine murder or that it had been committed in a barbaric manner. We have to bow before the view taken by the apex court, which is very self-illuminating. You see, in this case, the Honorable Apex Court provides enough insight about the implication of circumstantial evidence, about the implication of loss in evidence, about the implication of Section 27 of the Evidence Act, about the implication of Section 8 of the Evidence Act. I must pause here to say something which I omitted. It said that even if it is not taken to be admissible under Section 27 of the Indian Evidence Act, it can be taken to be admissible as conduct of the accused under Section 8 of the Indian Evidence Act. That means the implication of Section 8 of the Indian Evidence Act regarding conduct of the accused was also appropriately noticed and elaborated by the Honorable Apex Court. Then the court also indicated these features which ought to be present before a case is said to fall in the category of rarest of rare cases. We have had cases in the past where even a normal mind would say that yes, the award of capital punishment was appropriate. Take for example the case of Ranga Billa. Take the case of that girl from Haryana who, along with her boyfriend, did away with her whole parental family just to be able to marry that boy, or maybe possibly to inherit the entire property. I have no comments to make on that. Then the Nirvaya case, then the Nisari murder case. I also came across another case of great propensity wherein a mother, wife of a living husband, did away with her two sons with the help of her paramour by providing them poison-laced chocolates. These would obviously fall within the category of rarest of rare cases. The sentence of capital punishment stays on the statute book till date. Stop. On point of personal view, I reiterate that I am in favor of retention of capital punishment on the statute book. Obviously, it is in the discretion of the those authorized to legislate to decide upon whether to retain it or not. I am only indicating my personal point of view. But my experience further tells me, and the discerning in the field of law would bear me out, that the apex court has been very appropriately deciding upon the upholding of capital punishment in cases which really fell within the rarest of rare category. Thank you very much. I hope this presentation would be of some use to the students of law, to the law graduates who are aspiring to be judicial officers, and the lawyers who are in the infancy years of practice. Thank you.